The Intersystem Academy for Strategic Excellence floated in geosynchronous orbit above Theta 7, a neutral moon that nobody particularly wanted, and therefore everyone agreed was perfect for education. It was one of those compromises that made sense only to bureaucrats and diplomacy committees. The kind of place where 17 different species sent their best and brightest to learn how not to accidentally start wars over trade route disagreements or improper antenna positioning during formal greetings. The architecture was aggressively beige, designed by committee to offend absolutely no one's aesthetic sensibilities, which naturally meant it offended everyone equally. Democracy in action, really. The Academy's stated mission involved fostering understanding between species, promoting tactical cooperation, and creating the next generation of military strategists who could work across cultural boundaries. The unstated mission involved keeping young hotheads from prominent families busy enough that they couldn't cause interstellar incidents while their parents conducted actual important business. Both missions succeeded with roughly equal frequency. Among the 243 students currently enrolled, exactly one was human. This wasn't due to any quotas or deliberate exclusion, merely statistics. Humanity had been invited to join the greater galactic community approximately 40 standard years ago, which in cosmic terms meant they'd essentially just walked in the door, tracked mud on the carpet, and were still figuring out where the bathroom was. Most species required several centuries to even apply to institutions like the Academy. Humans, with characteristic impatience, had simply showed up. The human in question sat in the back corner of Tactical Adaptation 301, a third-year elective that most students took because it satisfied a requirement and reportedly involved minimal homework. Her name was Kenzie Valdez, though she went by Valdez to most of her classmates, who couldn't be bothered to remember human naming conventions involved two parts. She was unremarkable by human standards. Average height, dark hair pulled into a practical bun, the kind of person who could disappear in a crowd of three. By alien standards, she was tiny, fragile-looking, and according to the official Academy medical assessment, possessed the physical capabilities of a mildly athletic child from most species present. This assessment pleased Valdez tremendously. She'd spent 3 years carefully cultivating an image of determined mediocrity. Not bad enough to wash out, which would defeat the purpose, but not good enough to attract attention. Her combat scores hovered precisely at the 52nd percentile. Her tactical examinations returned results that her instructors described as adequate, if uninspired. Her physical assessments showed steady effort with predictably limited results. She attended every class, submitted every assignment on time, and maintained the academic profile of someone destined for a mid-level logistics position in some backwater sector. Perfect. The instructor, a Velthrian named Kos, who possessed 4 arms and an attitude problem, was currently pontificating about cross-species combat effectiveness ratings. The Velthrians were tall, vaguely reptilian, and absolutely convinced that their 4-armed physiology made them naturally superior warriors. They had exactly one notable military victory in their entire history, won mostly through luck and favorable terrain. But they'd been dining out on it for 3 centuries. The fundamental reality, Kos announced, manipulating a holographic display with 2 hands while gesturing dramatically with the other 2, is that physical capability determines tactical options. You cannot employ strategies that exceed your physiological limitations. This is simply logic. Valdez took notes. She was very good at taking notes. She'd filled 17 data tablets with notes over 3 years, none of which she'd ever needed to review because she remembered everything the first time. But taking notes looked studious, and studious was part of the brand. Consider humans. Koss continued, and Valdez felt the familiar weight of 47 pairs of eyes swiveling toward her. This happened approximately once per class session. She'd timed it. No offense to our colleague, naturally, but the species demonstrates clear physical limitations that constrain tactical applications. None taken, Valdez said mildly, still writing. She'd learned that mild agreement diffused these situations faster than argument. Argument suggested you cared enough to defend yourself, which suggested the criticism had struck a nerve, which invited further prodding. Boredom was better armor than outrage. Limited strength relative to body mass, Koss listed, counting on his fingers. Single focus vision, bilateral symmetry restricting multitasking capability, slow regeneration, moderate sensory range, restricted environmental tolerance. He spread all 4 hands in a gesture of sympathetic regret. These are simply facts, not judgments. They were facts. They were also catastrophically incomplete, but Valdez wasn't about to volunteer that information. She made a note in her tablet. Instructor emphasizes physical limitations as tactical constraints. See also, why Velthrians lost the Kessler campaign. She didn't write that last part, just thought it loudly. Across the room, a Dorvathi named Kresh made a chittering sound that translated as laughter. The Dorvathi looked like someone had crossed a mantis with a bad attitude and given it opposable thumbs. No offense, Valdez, but how did your species even develop space travel? You're built like prey animals. Spite, mostly, Valdez replied without looking up. And thumbs. Thumbs help. This got a general laugh from the class. Valdez had learned that self-deprecating humor played well. It made her seem harmless, likable, even. The tiny human who knew she was outclassed but showed up anyway. Good sport about the whole thing, plucky even. It was a role she could play in her sleep. But truly, pressed Koss, warming to his theme the way mediocre instructors did when they thought they'd found a teaching moment. This demonstrates why humans have avoided major conflicts since joining the galactic community. Your species' leadership understands these limitations and acts accordingly. Wisely, I might add. Valdez made another note. Instructor assumes human conflict avoidance stems from weakness rather than policy. Common error. What she said was, we're still learning the ropes, definitely. The class continued in this vein for another 40 minutes. Koss used humans as a recurring example of how physical limitations shaped strategic doctrine, which wasn't wrong but missed the point so spectacularly that Valdez had to bite her tongue twice. Other students chimed in with observations about various species' strengths and weaknesses, all of which carefully avoided mentioning that the Academy had seen exactly 0 actual combat between any attending species in its 200-year history. This was theoretical posturing, the academic equivalent of children arguing whose dad could beat up whose dad. When the lecture finally ended, Valdez packed her tablet with the same methodical care she applied to everything. Slow and steady, unremarkable. She'd nearly made it to the door when a hand, or more accurately, a manipulator appendage, landed on her shoulder. Valdez, a moment. Koss gestured toward his office with his lower left arm while dismissing another student with his upper right. Multitasking, his species' pride and joy. Valdez followed him into the cramped office, which smelled faintly of the mineral supplements Velthrians required. The walls were covered in certifications, commendations, and a holograph of Koss receiving some teaching award from someone important-looking. Standard academic vanity decor. I wanted to ensure, Koss began, settling into his chair with a posture that probably meant concern in his species' body language, that you understood my lecture today was not personal. I hold you in high regard as a student. High regard, Valdez translated mentally, for someone with your limitations. I understand, instructor. You are making a pedagogical point about physiological constraints. Precisely. Koss looked relieved. You're a credit to your species, truly. Your determination to succeed despite natural disadvantages is admirable. Many instructors have commented on it. Of course they had. Poor little human, trying so hard. Valdez smiled, the same pleasant smile she'd perfected over 3 years. I appreciate that, instructor. I'm just trying to learn as much as I can. And you will go far with that attitude, Koss assured her. Perhaps not in combat specializations, of course. But there are many vital support roles in modern military structures. Logistics, perhaps. Analysis. Humans excel at pattern recognition, I understand. We do like our patterns, Valdez agreed. Pattern recognition, she didn't add. Like recognizing when an instructor is a patronizing windbag who wouldn't last 15 seconds in actual combat. But she kept that pattern to herself. The next day brought physical adaptation trials, which was exactly as unpleasant as it sounded. The class gathered in Training Arena 7, a gymnasium-sized space with variable gravity, atmosphere, and temperature controls. The idea was to test how well students could adapt their combat techniques to different environmental conditions. The reality was an excuse for the naturally stronger species to show off while everyone else tried not to get injured. Today, announced the combat instructor, a massive three-noid named Vukis, who looked like an ambulatory boulder with anger management issues. We test adaptive response. You will face combat scenarios in non-optimal conditions. Your performance will be graded on technique, adaptation speed, and tactical awareness. The three-noids were built like tanks, moved like glaciers, and hit like meteor strikes. They made excellent combat instructors, primarily because their idea of gentle encouragement could crack ribs. Vukis was particularly old school, the kind of instructor who believed that pain was the best teacher and unconsciousness was just your body's way of saying you needed to try harder. Students were paired off by random selection, which everyone knew wasn't actually random but carefully calculated to avoid lethal matchups. Valdez drew Ren, a Kailari who resembled a bipedal wolf with 6-inch claws and an expression of permanent disdain. The Kailari were natural predators, faster than Velthrions, stronger than Dorvathi, and absolutely convinced that anything without fangs was basically a vegetable with delusions. Try not to die quickly, Ren suggested, flexing his claws in a way that might have been stretching or might have been a threat display. Hard to tell with Kailari. I'll see what I can do, Valdez replied, moving to the designated combat circle. Vukis set the environmental controls to 1.4 standard gravity and elevated temperature. Not enough to seriously impair anyone, just enough to make everyone uncomfortable. The goal wasn't to win, exactly, but to demonstrate proper adaptive technique while not getting dismembered. The match began with a buzzer that sounded like a dying air horn. Ren immediately rushed forward, because Kailari had exactly 2 tactical settings, aggressive and more aggressive. Valdez backpedaled, looking appropriately concerned, and attempted a defensive posture that her instructors had repeatedly told her was technically correct but lacking power. Ren's first swipe missed by 3 inches, which looked like a near miss but was actually Valdez's precise calculation. Too far, and she seemed overly skilled. Too close, and she might actually get hit, which would complicate the mediocrity performance. She countered with a strike that Ren blocked easily, making it look like she'd put genuine effort into an ultimately ineffective attack. The dance continued for 45 seconds. Valdez retreating, occasionally attempting counters that went nowhere, visibly struggling with the increased gravity that was actually barely noticeable to her. Ren growing frustrated, attacking more aggressively, convinced he was facing someone barely competent enough to avoid being shredded. Finally, following the script that all these training exercises followed, Valdez allowed herself to be swept into a grapple she could have avoided, executed a technically correct but practically useless escape attempt, and ended up on the mat with Ren's claws at her throat. Match over, exactly as expected. "Better," Vukas called out, though his tone suggested he was grading on a curve that started somewhere below actual competence. "Valdez, your defensive positioning improved, but you're still telegraphing your strikes. Ren, adequate pursuit, but you're too predictable in elevated gravity." Valdez nodded, accepting the criticism with appropriate humility. She'd telegraphed those strikes deliberately, naturally, because not telegraphing them would have resulted in actually landing hits, which would have raised uncomfortable questions. The entire performance had been carefully calibrated to show improvement from last term without actually demonstrating capability. As she returned to the sidelines, she caught fragments of conversation from a cluster of students watching the next match. Don't know why they bothered training humans in combat applications. Probably good for morale, makes them feel included. My clutch sibling said Earth military is basically ceremonial at this point. They know they're outclassed. Valdez grabbed a water container and drank, letting the conversation wash over her like background noise. This was the ecosystem she'd cultivated. Benign dismissal, casual condescension, the soft bigotry of low expectations. It was perfect camouflage. Nobody watched the harmless ones too closely. Nobody wondered what the mediocre student did in her spare time. Nobody asked questions when you performed exactly as poorly as they expected. The week continued in its established pattern. Tactical theory on Wednesday, where Valdez provided answers that were correct but uninspired. Strategic history on Thursday, where she took copious notes and contributed occasionally to discussions with safe, unremarkable observations. Xenopsychology on Friday, where she wrote a paper on human cognitive patterns that her instructor described as a competent self-assessment showing adequate introspection. Adequate, competent, unremarkable. These words appeared in her evaluations with satisfying regularity. The routine broke on station day, the Academy's mandatory assembly period where all students gathered for announcements, guests, lectures, or whatever administrative necessity required captive attention. Valdez settled into her usual seat in the back section, prepared for an hour of bureaucratic tedium that she could tune out while mentally reviewing actual tactical scenarios that interested her. Director Kesslin, a morphid who looked like someone had given a tree trunk administrative authority, took the podium with 3 of her 7 tentacle arms. Today's assembly focuses on practical military history. We've arranged a presentation on historical combat footage, demonstrating various tactical principles in action. That was mildly more interesting than budget presentations, at least. The lights dimmed, and the main holographic display activated, showing the title, Case Studies in Environmental Adaptation, Multi-Species Combat Analysis. The first footage showed a 3-noid ground campaign, all thundering charges and overwhelming force. Textbook 3-noid strategy, effective if unimaginative. The second showed Velthrian orbital assault tactics, emphasizing their multi-limb coordination advantages. Koss, sitting 3 rows ahead, sat up straighter, clearly proud. The third clip was labeled simply, Contested Zone 7, Frontier Incident, Unknown Participants. That was unusual. The Academy's historical database was meticulously cataloged. Unknown participants, wasn't standard nomenclature. Valdez felt something tighten in her chest, a sensation she hadn't experienced in 3 years of careful mediocrity. The footage began shakily, clearly from a helmet camera or similar personal recording device. The environment was a nightmare. High radiation, toxic atmosphere, gravity at 2.3 standard, and temperature fluctuations that would kill most species in minutes. The kind of place where combat wasn't just difficult, it was actively suicidal. The recording showed a defensive position, hastily constructed fortifications around what looked like a critical infrastructure point. The attackers were Kresh, a species that hadn't been seen in Academy circles, but were familiar from intelligence reports. Hostile, expansionist, and absolutely ruthless. They didn't attend diplomacy academies because they preferred conquest to conversation. The defenders were badly outnumbered, facing at least 40 Kresh warriors against what looked like a squad of maybe 8. The helmet cam's owner moved through the fortification with quick efficiency, and Valdez noticed details others might miss. The economical movements, the perfect spatial awareness, the way the soldier anticipated angles and positions before they became relevant. Then the attack began, and the auditorium went very quiet. The defender moved like violence itself had learned choreography. First target dropped with a precision strike to a weak point in Kresh armor that shouldn't have been visible at that range. Second target, coming from the right flank, intercepted mid-charge and redirected into a fortification support that collapsed onto third and fourth targets. The helmet cam never stopped moving, never hesitated, flowing from position to position like water-finding paths of least resistance. But it was the adaptation that made Valdez's carefully maintained mask almost slip. The gravity should have slowed everything down, but the soldier moved like they'd trained in heavy G their entire life. The toxic atmosphere that required sealed environment suits got weaponized. A punctured Kresh helmet here, a compromised seal there. The radiation that should have degraded everyone's performance was somehow incorporated into tactical timing, using radiation spikes to mask movement signatures. A Kresh warrior, massive and armored, charged the position. The defender waited until the last possible instant, then used the enhanced gravity against the attacker's momentum, redirecting the charge into a fall that would have been recoverable in normal gravity, but became catastrophic at 2.3 standard. The Kresh hit the ground with force that cracked their armor, and the defender's follow-up strike was clinically precise. Someone in the auditorium made a choking sound. The footage continued. The defenders were down to 4 now, visible in brief camera sweeps. They moved with coordinated efficiency that suggested extensive training together, or possibly extensive combat experience together, or possibly both. The Kresh kept coming, wave after wave, and the defenders kept adapting. Explosive trap, triggered with perfect timing as a Kresh squad bunched up navigating rubble. Suppressing fire from an elevated position, forcing attackers into a kill zone. Hand-to-hand combat when ammunition ran low. And that was when the auditorium started hearing gasps. The helmet cam owner engaged 3 Kresh simultaneously, which should have been suicide. The soldier used their smaller size as an advantage, moving inside the reach of larger opponents, turning their strength against them. One Kresh took a strike to the knee joint that hyperextended catastrophically in heavy gravity. Another got a combat blade through a weak point in neck armor that most species wouldn't have known existed. The third managed to land a blow that should have been devastating. But the defender rolled with it, using the momentum to create distance and reposition. The fighting went on for 8 minutes of footage that felt like hours. When it ended, the defenders had held their position. The Kresh had retreated, leaving 31 bodies behind. The final shot showed the defender removing their helmet in the now secured position, and Valdez watched 47 students and 6 instructors recognize her face simultaneously. The auditorium lights came up to absolute silence. Valdez continued sitting exactly as she had been, expression carefully neutral, while every person present stared at either the frozen hollow screen or directly at her. Director Keslan recovered first, though her tentacles were doing something agitated. That footage, that was apparently misfiled in the database under unknown participants. We apologize for the, unexpected disclosure. She looked at Valdez. Student Valdez, perhaps you could provide context. Valdez stood, aware of the theater this had become, and moved to the front of the auditorium with the same unhurried pace she used for everything. When she reached the podium, she glanced at the frozen image of her younger self, helmet off, covered in various substances that weren't her own blood, looking very tired. "Contested Zone 7, she said, voice carrying clearly in the silent space. 4 years ago, before I enrolled at the academy, I was part of a rapid response unit sent to prevent Kresh forces from capturing a terraform processing facility. The engagement lasted 6 hours total. That footage shows the final defensive stand. We held the position with acceptable casualties." "Acceptable casualties," repeated Koss weakly. His forearms hung limply. "You were how old?" 19 standard, Valdez replied. "I enlisted at 17, deployed at 18, made unit specialist at 19. She paused, considering what else needed saying. "That was my 4th combat deployment. I completed 7 total before mustering out and applying to the academy." Kresh, the Dorvathi who'd made the prey animal comment yesterday, had gone completely still in the way his species did when processing shocking information. "But your combat scores here are adequate if uninspired, yes," Valdez finished, "according to my evaluations." She let that hang in the air for a moment. "I read the Academy handbook very carefully before enrolling. The purpose of this institution is to foster understanding and cooperation between species, to train strategic thinkers who can work across cultural boundaries. It is not explicitly to identify the most dangerous individuals in any given room." She gestured at the frozen image. "That person is useful in very specific circumstances. This person," she indicated herself, "is useful in a different way. I decided which version of myself would better serve the Academy's stated mission." Vukis, the 3-noid combat instructor, looked like someone had struck him with his own training equipment. "You've been..." "What, exactly? Playing weak?" "Not weak," Valdez corrected. "Unremarkable. There's a difference. Weak gets you washed out. Unremarkable gets you left alone to actually learn things." She smiled slightly. "I've learned a lot in 3 years. Your tactical theory classes are actually excellent, by the way. Instructor Koss's lectures on physiological constraints are very informative, even if the examples sometimes miss nuance." Koss made a sound that might have been Velthrian for "you're killing me." Ren, who defeated her just days ago in the training arena, slowly raised a claw. "Our match. You threw it?" "Every match," Valdez confirmed. "Well, not through exactly. I genuinely tried to execute the techniques we were learning. I just tried at precisely the 52nd percentile of capability. It's actually harder than going full strength, requires more control. Excellent training." The silence had evolved from shocked to something approaching existential crisis. Valdez recognized the expression on several faces. It was the look of people rapidly reassessing every interaction they'd ever had, searching for clues they'd missed, wondering what else they'd gotten catastrophically wrong. Director Keslan's tentacles had calmed somewhat. Student Valdez, this is highly irregular. Your application materials made no mention of military service. They made no mention of military service in combat roles, Valdez clarified. I listed my service time accurately. Nobody asked for specifics, and I didn't volunteer them. Not lying, just selective truth. There's a difference. But why? That was from a student Valdez didn't know well, a morphid like the director. If you have these capabilities, why hide them? Valdez considered the question genuinely. How many of you have ever been in actual combat? Not training exercises, real combat where people die if you make mistakes. She waited, unsurprised when no hands rose. That's normal. This is an academic institution. Most of you will go into strategic planning, diplomatic liaison, coordination roles. You'll be excellent at them, because you're learning theory without the trauma that comes from practical application. She gestured at the screen again. That person has trauma. That person has nightmares. That person checks every room for exits and fields of fire. That person can't hear certain sounds without tactical assessment kicking in. I didn't want to be that person here. I wanted to be a student who could focus on learning without everyone either being afraid of me or constantly testing themselves against me. Also, she added, because honesty might as well be complete. Human military doctrine emphasizes that our greatest strategic advantage is being underestimated. Everyone assumes we're physically limited, therefore tactically constrained, therefore not a threat. It's a very comfortable assumption for other species to make. We don't discourage it. The implications of that landed like another bomb. Koss found his voice, though it was shaky. Are you saying Earth's military has been deliberately, playing weak on the galactic stage? Not weak, Valdez repeated patiently. Unremarkable. We participate in joint exercises. We perform adequately. We meet treaty obligations. We're just not very flashy about it. Nobody worries about the adequate performers. Nobody watches them too closely. Nobody prepares contingencies for them. She smiled, and there was something in it that made several students lean back slightly. Until they need to worry, and by then it's usually too late. That's the theory anyway. I'm just a student. What do I know about strategic doctrine? Vukas rumbled something in his species language that the translators politely rendered as significant concern. Then, in standard, your performance in my class. You could have learned less, Valdez suggested. Your teaching is solid, instructor. I learned proper technique. The fact that I already knew 11 ways to kill with that technique doesn't make the lesson less valuable. Understanding why technique works is more important than just knowing how to apply it. You taught me the why. She looked around the auditorium, meeting eyes, seeing the recalculation happening behind them. Look, I'm not trying to make anyone feel bad. You're all excellent students. You'll be excellent officers and strategists. I genuinely respect every instructor here. I've learned things that combat experience alone wouldn't teach. That's why I came. But the combat scores, Kresh said weakly. The physical assessments. You've been intentionally failing? Not failing. 52nd percentile isn't failing. It's just aggressively average. Valdez shrugged. I needed to be here as a student, not as a curiosity or a threat or a measuring stick. So I made myself unremarkable enough that people would stop paying attention and I could get to work. Director Keslan's tentacles made a gesture that probably meant something administrative. We're going to need to discuss your continued enrollment. This level of deception... Respectfully, Director. What deception? Valdez kept her voice level. I met all enrollment requirements. I've broken no academy rules. I've completed every assignment to the standard required. I've harmed no one. I've been exactly the student the academy asked for. Someone committed to learning, who works well with others, who respects the institutional mission. The fact that I didn't volunteer my complete service history isn't deception. It's discretion. She paused, then added, "Also, my government would prefer if I continued my enrollment. Earth takes education seriously, and we'd be disappointed to have our student expelled for the crime of being better at combat than expected. It might raise questions about what else we're better at than expected." The threat was polite, almost gentle, but it was definitely a threat. Keslin's tentacles twitched in what might have been irritation or resignation. "We will discuss this. For now dismissed, all students, except you, Valdez." The exodus was rapid and very quiet. Valdez waited while the auditorium emptied, watching her classmates file out with backward glances, whispering to each other. Tomorrow would be interesting. She'd gone 3 years cultivating benign invisibility, and now she'd have to navigate actual visibility. When only the director and senior instructors remained, Keslin gestured Valdez closer. That was quite the revelation. "Not my first choice for how it happened," Valdez admitted. "But I suppose it was inevitable. Database security isn't what it should be." Indeed. Keslin's tentacles arranged themselves in what might have been thoughtfulness. "Your point about discretion versus deception has merit. However, this creates complications." "I imagine it does," Valdez agreed. "Though I would point out that nothing has actually changed. I'm the same student I was this morning. I have the same goals, the same commitment to learning. The only difference is that everyone now knows I could have scored higher on physical assessments if I'd wanted to." Vukas rumbled. "Could have scored higher. That's putting it mildly." "Modesty," Valdez replied. "I'm trying to cultivate it. New approach." Koss, who had been silent, finally spoke. "My lectures, about human limitations. You sat through all of them. Why didn't you say anything?" "Because you weren't wrong, instructor. Humans do have those limitations. We're not as strong as Threnoids, not as coordinated as Velthrians, not as fast as Kylari. Those are facts." Valdez met his eyes. "The error is assuming that limitations equal weakness. We have limitations. We just build our tactics around them instead of pretending they don't exist. It's actually very practical." "And the other students," Keslin said. "How do you intend to proceed with them?" Valdez considered. "Same as before, probably. I'll attend class, complete assignments, try to learn. They'll be awkward for a while, then they'll adjust. People adapt. It's kind of what we all do." "You can't go back to being unremarkable now," Vukas pointed out. "No," Valdez agreed. "But I can be remarkably normal about having been unremarkably competent. New strategy, same goal. I'm adaptable." Keslin's tentacles made a gesture that was definitely resignation. "Very well. Conditional continued enrollment. You will meet with me weekly to discuss integration concerns. If this disrupts the Academy's learning environment, it won't," Valdez promised. "Or at least, I'll minimize disruption. Best I can offer." "I suppose it will have to be." Keslin waved a tentacle dismissively. "Go. I need to determine how to explain this to the Board of Governors." Valdez left the auditorium, emerging into the corridor where several students were definitely not obviously waiting to ambush her with questions. She recognized a few from her classes, others from passing acquaintance. "Is it true?" one asked. "All of it?" "The footage was authentic," Valdez confirmed, "if that's what you mean." "But you've been here 3 years," another student said. Acting like you could barely fight? Why? Already explained that, Valdez replied. Wanted to learn, not perform. Turns out being the interesting human is less educational than being the boring one. She started walking, and the cluster followed like particularly uncertain ducklings. What's going to happen now? Kresh asked, antennae twitching nervously. Tomorrow there's advanced strategic planning at OR 900, Valdez said practically. I'll attend. Take notes. Probably contribute adequate if uninspired observations. You'll all stare at me for the first 15 minutes, then get bored and focus on the actual lesson. By next week, this will be old news. She glanced at them. Or everyone will be weird about it forever and my education will be compromised. But I'm optimistic about the first option. Ren caught up, moving with the predatory grace his species was known for. Our match. Tell me honestly, how fast could you have won? Valdez considered lying, decided against it. 4 seconds, maybe 5 if I was being cautious. You telegraph with your left shoulder before strikes. It's correctable, you just need to work on it. He stared at her. You've been coaching me? While pretending to lose? Not pretending to lose, actually losing within the parameters I'd set for myself. But yes, I noticed the shoulder thing. Mentioned it to Vukas once. He worked it into a general technique lecture. You've gotten better since last term. I thought I was improving through my own skill, Ren said, sounding almost offended. You are, Valdez assured him. I just provided observation. You did the work. That's actual improvement. The group walked in silence for a moment, processing. Finally, one of the Morphids spoke up. What's it like? Actual combat? Terrible, Valdez said immediately. Loud, confusing, terrifying. Lots of waiting, then everything happens too fast. People die, sometimes because of mistakes you made, sometimes randomly. The nightmares are worse than the actual fighting. She paused. But you asked, so that's the honest answer. It's not glorious. It's not fun. It's just necessary sometimes. And if you're good at it, you survive to feel bad about it later. That's horrible, the Morphid said. Yes, Valdez agreed. That's why I came here instead of re-enlisting. Fighting is sometimes necessary. Learning how to avoid fighting is better. Strategy and diplomacy that prevent wars are worth more than tactics that win them. They'd reached the residential section. Students peeled off toward their various quarters, still processing, still uncertain. Valdez made it to her room and sealed the door, finally allowing herself to drop the careful neutral expression she'd maintained. 3 years of careful mediocrity, gone in one accidentally accessed database file. She'd have to adapt, find a new equilibrium, figure out how to be simultaneously competent and educational. It would be challenging. She found herself smiling. Challenging was good. Challenging meant learning. And really, wasn't that the point? Her comm panel blinked with incoming messages. 17 from classmates, 6 from instructors, 1 from Earth's diplomatic liaison that just read, "Explain, immediately." She'd answer them later. Right now, she had an assignment due for advanced strategic planning, and being accidentally outed as dangerously competent didn't exempt her from homework. The essay question was about balancing force projection with diplomatic overtures. Valdez read it, considered her answer, and began typing. She kept it, adequate, uninspired, exactly the kind of work she'd been submitting for 3 years. Some things didn't need to change. Though she did add a footnote about how underestimation could be its own strategic advantage, with proper references to several military theorists. It seemed relevant. Tomorrow would bring stares, whispers, awkward questions. Next week would bring adjustment, recalibration, new dynamics. Next month, maybe normalcy of a different kind. Valdez had survived 6-hour firefights in toxic environments against numerically superior forces. She could probably survive being notorious at a military academy. Probably. She finished the essay, submitted it, and settled in for another night of meticulously ordinary routine. The only difference was that now everyone knew the ordinary was optional. She'd just chosen it anyway. The really funny part, she reflected as she prepared for sleep, was that the combat footage they'd seen was from her 4th deployment. Her 7th had been significantly more impressive, but there was no reason to mention that. Some things could stay unremarkable. She slept soundly, as she always did. The nightmares she'd mentioned were real, but manageable. 3 years of peace had helped. 3 more years of education would help more. And then, maybe she'd be qualified to help others avoid needing the skills that footage had displayed. That was the goal anyway. Unremarkable, adequate, and desperately trying to make combat experience obsolete through better strategy. The universe would probably have other plans. But Valdez had learned to adapt. It's what humans did best, after all, even when everyone assumed they couldn't.